Picture this. You've trekked for hours to this perfect spot. The light is just right. You hit the shutter only to find out that your foreground was out of focus. Let's fix that. Hey everyone, it's great to see you all again. If you've ever reviewed your photos and been disappointed that your images weren't sharp, you're definitely not alone. Whether you're shooting epic vistas or intimate details, focus can make or break your image. It's one of the first things viewers notice. In today's video, I'll walk you through everything you need to know about focus, from mastering depth of field to overcoming common challenges. And make sure you stick around to the end because I'll be sharing one bonus tip that will completely transform how you approach focus, one that many photographers overlook. So I hope you all enjoy. The first thing that we want to take into account is your depth of field. Depth of field refers to how much of your image appears sharp from front to back, influenced by three key factors: aperture, focal length, and distance to your subject. Look at this image for example. At f2.8, our subject is tack-sharp, but our background is blurry. At f8 to f11, our background becomes more in focus, and at f16, everything is in focus, but the image appears slightly soft. For landscapes, using something like f8 or f11 is often the sweet spot for sharpness. However, every lens has an aperture sweet spot. Play around with your lens on location and figure out where the sharpest aperture is for your gear. We'll also talk about which aperture you may want to use for different scenarios. Going smaller, like f18 or f22, can introduce diffraction, which softens your image. Think of aperture as a balancing act. Too wide and you lose depth, too narrow and diffraction can degrade sharpness. When in doubt, test your aperture settings in the field to find the sharpest result. And for extreme depth, try focus stacking. A little bit more on that later. The next thing we're going to be talking about is focus mode. Most cameras have multiple focus modes. For still landscapes where you have plenty of time to focus, we want to try to use manual focus. This allows you to manually select what part of your scene you want in focus, like this. However, for fast-moving subjects or other kind of photography, autofocus is something that you might want to try out. I have an entire other video talking about the different kinds of focus modes if you want to check that out up here. And another thing you want to think about is switching your camera to back button focus. This separates the focus button from the shutter, so you're not losing focus when you press down that button. I have mine set to C1 on the top of my Sony camera. This gives you flexibility to recompose your shot without losing that locked-in focus. Once we figured out how much depth of field we need and the focus mode you're going to be using, let's see how we're going to use that focus mode the right way. A reliable rule of thumb for landscape photography is to focus about 1/3 into the scene. This helps balance the foreground and background sharpness. I'm sure you've heard a lot of photographers talk about the hyperfocal distance, essentially the mathematical equation to find the perfect focus point in your image, which usually lands about a 1/3 into your scene. However, for me, I've never found that really practical when trying to search for a composition. For me, I always just experiment on location with my aperture and manual focus when I have the chance. Really zoom in using the focus peaking option on your camera and make sure you have everything in focus. And remember, small adjustments can make a big difference. Take the time to verify your focus before committing to the shot. After taking the shot, make sure you're zooming in on the back LCD to make sure everything is tack-sharp. Your gear plays a huge role in achieving tack-sharp focus. Let's start with the most important tool for landscapes, a tripod. Even minor camera shakes can ruin sharpness, especially at slower shutter speeds. A sturdy tripod eliminates that issue. A remote shutter release or even a self 2-second timer ensures that you're not introducing any vibrations when pressing that shutter button. Even with the right settings, minor focus imperfections can happen. Here's how we can troubleshoot that on location. In low contrast scenes, your camera may struggle to lock in focus. Try focusing on a nearby high contrast edge instead. Make sure you're in the right focus mode before you take the shot. If your focus keeps shifting when recomposing, switch to manual focus or back button focus to lock it in. Blur can also result from a dirty lens or miscalibrated autofocus. Keep your gear clean and calibrate your lenses if needed. Remember, sharpness isn't just about gear settings, it's about being intentional with your process. But what if you're struggling to capture tack-sharp images from bottom to top? Maybe your foreground is really close and your background is way far away. This calls for a technique called focus stacking. Focus stacking is a technique where you take multiple images at different focal points and blend them all together to get tack-sharp focus throughout the entire scene. If you want to go more in depth with this technique, I have a whole nother video that you can watch. But essentially what you'll do is you'll take one image focusing on the foreground where the midground and background are slightly out of focus, one shot in the midground where the midground is in focus, the foreground is out of focus, and the background is out of focus, and then lastly, one where the background is in focus and the midground and foreground might be slightly out of focus. You'll then jump into Photoshop and blend them all together to get a seamless tack-sharp image. Practice all of these techniques and experiment on your own, and remember that making mistakes is part of the process. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten home just to have a bunch of out of focused images that I didn't make that mistake the next time I went out to shoot. So I do hope you all learned something from this week's video. If you didn't already know, I started a Discord server for the entire community to come together, share photos, and give feedback, and then at the end of every month, I'll be selecting one of your photos as a monthly contest winner. Other than that, if you could subscribe to my newsletter for all sorts of updates, and then for vlog, blog, and other video updates, if you could like and follow my Facebook page and Instagram. Other than that, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.